This video is a short introduction to the topic of causal inference. In causal inference, we try to answer questions like, for example, to what extent will education give you a higher salary? We try to isolate the effect of education on salary. Or we could ask, to what extent does alcohol influence your health or your mortality? Another example could be if you have a pharmaceutical, to what extent will that influence your mortality or your blood pressure or something like that? So we'll say it's blood pressure. So these are three examples of questions we try to answer in causal inference. We try to find methods that can isolate the effect of one variable on something else. Now there are two basic answers to these questions. One is that we just observe what happens to people who get, for example, education, and people who do not have education. We just observe data and compare the means or do something. So observational data is one source of evidence for answering questions like that, observational evidence. The other general source of information we could have is to run experiments. So we give some people alcohol and some people will not get alcohol, and we see what happens. Experiments. Sometimes observational evidence is called real-world evidence, and sometimes experiments is called randomized controlled trials. So these are the two general sources of information we have. Now, if you ask what is the best source of information, well, there is no best source of information in the sense that we can use both, and sometimes one is good and sometimes the other is good. So the question is when. So if the question is RCT versus RVE, real world evidence, the answer is first of all both. We should try to gather both evidence, but there are some differences. Randomized controlled trials, they have one big advantage, which is that we can compare the people or the outcomes because there is no systematic difference between the people who get the intervention and the people who do not get the intervention. At least ideally there is no such difference. But if you use observational evidence, we have something called selection bias, and that's the big problem with selection or with observational evidence. So the problem we have here is selection bias. That's basically, and I'll give you an example. Let's say you have education here, and you want to find the effect of education on your salary. There might be a factor behind both of these things. So even if you find a relationship between education and salary, so people with a high education also have a high salary, maybe there's a factor behind there. Say it's IQ, for example, and say that a high IQ leads you to take more education, but it also give you a higher salary. So maybe the effect we observe behind education and salary is not really an effect of education, but the fact that this IQ is behind both. Sometimes they call that a confounding variable. So the question is then, if you just observe in the real world, people with education and without education, maybe you've forgotten that there's a common factor behind. So that's always going to be a problem with observational evidence. And in randomized controlled trials, on average at least, we don't have that problem. There is another problem though with experiments, and the problem there is more external validity. At least that's one of the problems. The problem is basically that in a tightly controlled environment, maybe we get one result, but when we do the same intervention in a more loosely controlled environment, in a different way maybe, with different people, maybe we don't get the same results. So even though we do a randomized controlled trial and we find an effect, or we don't find an effect, maybe the effect will not be the same when we apply it more generally. So that's a problem in the RCTs. There are many other problems also, of course, so we can do this back and forth here. For example, some of the experiments are impossible to conduct, or they could be very expensive. So there's a discussion there, but these are the two main problems. The problem with observational evidence is selection bias, and the problem with randomized controlled trials is external validity. Now in this course, I will try to focus on observational evidence, and what we're going to do is try to, since the main problem is selection bias, we're going to try to find methods to solve the problem of selection bias in real-world evidence. So that's the main topic of this course, to solve that problem, to reduce that problem. And there are some methods we can use, and we're going to go over lots of different methods. So they could be, for example, ordinary least square is one method, OLS. Or we could try something like propensity score matching is another method we're going to touch on. We could try something like regression discontinuity design. So there are lots of different methods here we could try. We can go on and do instrumental variables is another method. So many methods we're going to try to explain. But before we can do that, we also need to formalize things a little bit so we have a language to discuss these issues. And that's going to be the next topic.